Welcome back to Slumber IV. Sleep paralysis. It seems we cover this topic a lot on this channel. But what happens when it turns into more than just sleep paralysis? What if what you're seeing is not a hallucination, but something much more real and sinister? In today's video, we have 4 stories that will cover a range of different topics. As always, the writers' links will be in the description. Huge thank you to all of them for allowing me to share their stories with all of you. If you have a story you'd like to send in, the email is rylhstories@gmail.com. Also, I feel like I have to address the support on the last video. I was not expecting that at all. But seriously, thank you all for the support lately. It really is nice to see. I hope you all enjoy the stories, and I hope you all have a great night, as always. Everyone has their fears, whether they are rational or irrational. Mine has always been dolls. Not all dolls. Mainly just the ones that are a bit too human. I think it's mainly the eyes that get to me. So I'm sure you can imagine, I was ecstatic to find out I was the inheritor of my very own clown doll. A gift from my late great aunt. I'd met her maybe once or twice in my life. So why she left this of all things to me was beyond me. The doll was something straight from my nightmares. I mean, a doll was bad enough, but then you throw in the clown element as well. The doll's glass-like face was painted white, with red accents and markings over the eyes, mouth, and cheeks. The eyes themselves, however, were nothing but a black void. It has thick white hair jetting out the sides, and a round hat that almost resembles a cherry on top. Its outfit is essentially your typical clown attire. Like the face, it was a mixture of red and white. This doll is about the size of a toddler, so way too big for me to feel comfortable anywhere near it. I would have given it away, but out of respect to my grandmother, I kept it. So naturally, its new house would be my closet. And I placed it in the back on top of an old dresser that held clothes that no longer fit me. I thought that would be that, and my life would go on as it always had. Unfortunately, that would not be the case. I'm not exactly a tidy person, so my clothes rarely made it back to my closet, so I didn't have to see my clown friend for quite a while. It was a few weeks later before I finally went into my closet on the quest for a clean pair of jeans. There he was, sitting on the floor in front of the dresser. I assumed he must have fallen off the dresser somehow, because I clearly remembered setting him on top. Those empty black eyes were too much for me though, so I grabbed my jeans quickly and left without bothering to put him back on top. I spent the rest of the day thinking about how that doll could have fallen off the dresser. So, as a curious person, I decided to check out the closet when I returned home. The doll was there, of course, but it was back to its original position atop the dresser. I approached it and looked into those empty eyes. Nothing. As much as it creeped me out, it was just a doll, right? I must have just imagined seeing it on the floor. I live alone, so there's no way anyone else could have moved it. Regardless, I decided to stay clear of the closet as much as possible. A couple nights later, I was awoken to the sound of what seemed to be laughter, and it just had to be coming from the closet. It was very faint, which is why I was a bit surprised it woke me. I am generally a heavy sleeper, so for something like this to wake me was quite odd. The last thing I wanted to do was go into that closet, so I decided to attempt to wait it out. After about 30 seconds, I heard a loud thump noise, and then the laughter stopped. After turning on every light possible, and arming myself with a kitchen knife, I decided it was time to check the closet. I slowly opened the door, and it was completely normal. Absolutely nothing out of place. Even the doll was sat upon its normal spot on top of the dresser. I picked up the doll and felt around to see if there was any sort of speech box, but there wasn't. With a loud sigh, I set the clown back down and left my closet. Perhaps I was finally losing it. Over the next couple days, I was on high alert. I began to notice small things here and there went missing or were moved. Most notably, small bits of food that I swear I hadn't eaten. I relentlessly searched every nook and cranny of my small house, looking for any possible signs of vermin or any other intruders. Everywhere except the closet, of course. Alas, my searches turned up nothing, farther confirming my idea that I was in fact losing it. That was until a couple nights later. The laughing returned. Only this wasn't just a faint laughter. This was a booming cackle. The laugh seemed to reverberate throughout my whole house. I was petrified. I didn't dare move an inch from my bed. I began to hear loud banging noises from my closet as the laughing persisted, until suddenly my closet door swung open. A large, dark figure emerged and stormed out of my room. I heard it sprint through my house, opening my front door and leaving. As soon as this happened, the laughter stopped. After reminding myself to breathe, I was finally able to move from my bed. I approached the closet. What I found devastated me. My old dresser was no longer against the wall. Instead, it was now in the middle of my closet. And where the dresser had been was a hole easily large enough for a human to fit behind, but small enough that you would never notice if it was being covered up. Beside the hole was the doll, sat perfectly up with one arm outstretched towards the hole. I didn't dare look into the hole, afraid of what I might find. Instead, I grabbed the doll and locked myself in my car as I called 911. The police later confirmed my suspicions of what had happened. Someone had been living in my home. Inside the hole was a pallet where the person had been sleeping, as well as a small amount of trash. Worst of all was the person had a small collection of pocket knives. Probably not meant as weapons, but it's still not exactly comforting thinking about it. Since that night, my clown friend has not left my room. He now has his own special perch on the table next to my bed. I'm still not a huge fan of dolls, but perhaps they aren't all so bad. Dreams are supposed to be a magical place. A place where we can escape from our everyday lives, where our imagination can run free. I have often heard my friends complain that they don't dream enough, or that their dreams are too dull. But not me. Ever since I was young, I have had dreams very frequently, and I used to enjoy them. However, nowadays my dreams are a bit different. I'll start at the beginning, because where else would I start? I have always had quite a mundane life, living in a small town with next to nothing to do. Friends weren't exactly my strong suit growing up, so I relied on my imagination for my own entertainment. Although I think this is quite a common thing for most kids to do anyway. As I said, I would dream very frequently, almost every night if not every other night. Nothing ever stood out from these dreams though. In fact, most would be forgotten by the time I crawled my way to breakfast. Unfortunately, these forgettable dreams couldn't last forever. I am currently 22 years old, and the new dreams began around 2 years ago. It was a night like any other. Nothing abnormal happened during the day. I was simply ready to go to sleep, and so I did. Once I did, I found myself in a world of gray. It wasn't necessarily dark, just bland. There were gray houses, gray streets, gray grass, essentially an atypical neighborhood, but everything was a shade of gray. Looking around, I saw almost nothing of note, until I spotted a woman sitting on a bench. A woman I did not recognize. From what I've read, the brain does not simply invent faces. We can only dream of what we've seen. So perhaps this woman was someone I had walked by in a crowd once, or seen in the background of a TV show. Someone I had seen just long enough to conjure their face in my dream. The woman looked to be in her mid-30s with long gray hair, small gray eyes, gray lips, and her clothes were, well, you guessed it, gray. She had a typical soccer mom look. That is, if soccer moms had no color to them. She stood there completely still, like she was simply a prop to this world. Then, after a long stare down, she began to raise her right arm. She began to point at something. The direction she was pointing was close to me, but not directly at me. As I began to look at what she was pointing at, I was ripped from my dream. I found myself lying in my bed on my side. My heart was beating incredibly fast, yet I had no clue why. Thoughts were racing through my mind. Who was that woman? What was she pointing at? My mind was moving so fast it took me a few moments to realize I couldn't move. I was completely frozen laying on my side, with my head facing my wall. That's when I heard my bedroom door open. My eyes were wide open, but I was not in a position that I could see who was at my door. My mind began to rationalize the situation. It must have been my younger sister. Perhaps she had a nightmare and she had to come to my room for comforts. I began to hear footsteps approaching my bed. The closer they got, the more I thought how heavy these footsteps were for a small child to have. But despite my suspicions, I could not move. The only thing I could do was wait as my eyes were glued to the wall, just out of sight of my intruder. Eventually, the footsteps stopped at the foot of my bed. The next sound would be the creaking of the springs in my mattress as someone began to slowly crawl onto my bed. I could feel the mattress begin to sink where my feet lay. In my position, this person was completely unseen by me, and they continued to climb until they were directly behind me. I began to feel light breaths down my neck, yet I still could not move. This went on for what seemed like hours. Then the breathing stopped, as I felt a cold hand go across the midsection of my back. This was finally enough. I regained control of my body as I flipped over and let out a monstrous scream. Yet there was no one there, nor was there any sign anyone had ever been there. No impressions had been left in my bed, and my door was still shut like it always was when I went to sleep. There was nothing. Most people have probably already decided that what I experienced was sleep paralysis, and I agree. I have done extensive research on sleep paralysis since that day, and it matches up almost perfectly to what I experienced. However, there is one problem. The spot on my back where the cold hand touched me now holds a scar. It's a small line that stretches horizontally across the mid of my back. Before that night, I had no wound there, nor any previous scarring on my back. As much as I wished it was just a terrible case of sleep paralysis, even then I knew it had to be something more. Life turned to normal for a short while after this. I no longer dreamed at all, which did not bother me. I did begin to sleep with my bathroom light on for extra light, as I could no longer stand to be in a room that was too dark to see. I also began sleeping on my back, so even if I was experiencing sleep paralysis, I could have a clear view of my whole room. After about a month, I almost convinced myself that I was delusional. I even chalked up the scarring to something that I must have missed at some point. Perhaps it had always been there. That was until the second dream came. Once again, I found myself in the gray world. It was much the same as last time. This time in almost empty streets and, of course, with no color. Only now it was not a woman that stood in front of me. Instead, it was a man. The man was older, probably in his 70s, if not a bit older. But once again, it was a face I could not recognize. The previous woman had had no expression. In fact, the only part of her that even moved was her arm when she began to point. This man, however, was wearing a smirk, as if he knew something that I did not. But other than this, he too was completely motionless. I guessed what would happen next, and sure enough, the man began to raise his arm. Only he did not begin to point anywhere in my direction. Instead, he extended his arm all the way to his shoulder and extended his thumb as if to say, "Behind me." Despite what happened last time, I was too curious to not attempt to see what he was pointing at. I began moving towards the man. I placed my right hand on the man to push him aside, and as I did, I once again found myself in my bed. This time I realized instantly that I could not move. My eyes darted towards my door, anticipating another visit like last time, only it did not come. Instead, I noticed a shadow on the edge of my bathroom wall, reflecting off the light that I had left on. The shadow seemed to have been waiting for me to notice it, because once I did, it began to raise a hand and held it there, almost as if it was giving a still wave. After a few seconds, it put down its hand, and it slowly began to inch its way across the wall, stretching into my room. I wanted to run, scream, or do anything to get away from this shadow, but I couldn't. My body refused to move as this shadow slowly crept along the wall towards me. After a few agonizing moments, the shadow finally reached the wall next to me, and it paused, as if to study me. Then after a few seconds, it overtook me. The moment it happened, I once again regained control of my body, and once again I let out a scream that could terrify anyone. My whole body felt like it was on fire. It was a much more intense sensation than the cold touch I had felt last time. It only lasted a few seconds, however, and as I looked down at myself, I noticed I was fine, covered in sweat and possibly some other bodily fluids, but otherwise fine. That is except for the new scar that adorned my right hand, the same hand that I had touched the old man with. At this point, I was more confused than ever. The dreams had come from nowhere, along with the living nightmares. The gray world obviously had to have some connection to what was happening to me. Each dream the figure had pointed somewhere, and each time I attempted to look, I was brought back to reality, or at least I think it was reality. I want to believe it just to be a combination of odd dreams and sleep paralysis, but the scars staring back at me make me question everything. It took almost an entire year for the next dream to come, and in between I had no other dreams. Of course, when it came, where else would I be but the gray world? This time I was inside a house, an empty and colorless house. I began to move from room to room, until I spotted it, a child sitting on the floor. I say it because this child was essentially androgynous. I could not tell whether it was a boy or a girl. They were around 8 years old, I'd say, with mid-length gray hair, and no facial characteristics that would give away gender. The child was sat upon the floor coloring. Well, if you would consider a gray crayon drawing on a gray piece of paper coloring, that is. Without even looking up, the child began to raise its arm that didn't have the crayon, and began to point to the side. "I won't look," I said. This caused the child to stop drawing and look up at me. "But you have to look," it said. "Why? Every time I do, I wake up to something terrible," I responded. "If you don't look, he'll get angry," the child said, ignoring my question. "Who is he?" I beckoned. The child let out a sigh before saying, "Just hurry and look, you're running out of time." After everything I had experienced, I had no reason to trust what the child was saying. So instead of looking, I instead closed my eyes, and I began trying to will myself back to reality. And after a few seconds, it worked. I found myself back in my bed, and this time I was fully capable of moving. Nothing came for me that night. No mysterious figure climbing into my bed, and no shadows approaching me. Had I beaten the gray world? Was it just that simple as to not trust the people there? That brings it back to current day. Over a year later, I'd like to think that it's all over, that I will never have to see the gray world again, but my normal dreams have not returned. In fact, I haven't dreamt a single time since my last night in the gray world. I still have so many questions. Who were those people? What were they pointing at that they wanted me to look so bad? But most importantly, who was the child referring to? Could this possibly be the person or entity that is responsible for what has been happening to me? I'm not sure. If I never dream again, I would be satisfied. But I fear that won't be the case. I'm terrified that one day the gray world will return. But I'm even more terrified of what I'll find when I wake up. Will he be waiting for me? I'm posting here in hopes for someone to give me advice, as I have no idea what to do. It knows I'm writing this, and it will know what you comment, so please don't hold back. The night this started seemed like any other night. It was about a month ago, sometime in mid-October. I got back from a long day of work. I work as a janitor in the town elementary school. I got the job right out of high school and have had it for about 3 years now. My town is tiny, and it's a very know-everyone area. There's only about 200 or so people living here, so because of my connections and close relationships to everyone at the school, I got the job. The school is extremely small, and there is only ever one janitor at a time, and Mr. Buckley, the old one, had recently passed on the job at 76. Bless his heart. I have never seen anything odd at this job. Nothing supernatural in the slightest. The school was creepy, with a basement and sub-basement. Even a huge room down there that was used for the coal-burning furnace. The basement is where I spend most of my time, and I'm never creeped out by it. I've gone to that school all my life. It's grades pre-K to 8th, and it's like a second home. I even had a little spot in the basement where I set up a desk and stuff. One day I had to work late. Usually I would be done by 5 if there is nothing after school. But this day there was a Halloween fundraiser, and I was there cleaning until 10 at night. It didn't bother me much. But what did was the prank pulled on me by some high school kids that had come. They had broken all the light bulbs on the second floor. Every last one. The second floor wasn't huge, just a hallway and about 4 rooms in the bathrooms. But I had to sweep all the broken glass and replace the bulbs, and be extra careful since the younger classes were up there. I was on the last room, and it was about 12 in the morning. I was agitated and tired, and I had work the next day. The room was pitch black, except for the big flashlight I propped on a chair so I could see, and the light seeping in from the hallway. I was stood on the stepladder, screwing in the last bulb. I went to the switch and it flickered on. I let out a sigh of relief. I was finally done. But seconds after it turned on, it began flickering again. Rapidly, I mean, like a rave. The lights seemed to get even brighter, and I had to cover my eyes. Not knowing what to do, I stumbled to the switch and frantically slapped my hand over the wall in hopes of turning it off. And I did. But it was only dark for seconds before it started up again. And this time it was the hallway lights too, and all the other classrooms, and the flashlight I left on the chair. I was freaked out, and in a bit of shock. I never had to deal with this before, and I was definitely no electrician. It didn't click as to the weirdness of the flashlight flickering. It was battery powered and not connected to the school electricity at all, but I was too panicked to realize that. But then I turned my head to the back of the classroom. It was definitely no electricity failure. I know I wasn't imagining this, and whether you believe me or not is not my problem. But in the corner farthest from me was a figure, tall, like 8 feet or so. As it reached the ceiling, it didn't look human. Its proportions were off. Arms that reached below its knees, long fingers. A back bent in unnatural directions. I didn't scream, but my breath felt like it was knocked out of my lungs. I didn't know what to do, and my mind practically blanked out. But eventually my mind came to its senses and I ran. As fast as I could, I ran out of the school and back to my house. I didn't go to work the next day, and my mother was a bit concerned. I said I felt really sick, but it must have been Mother's intuition that I wasn't. I'm forced to live with her and my 4 younger siblings until I can afford my own house. I've seen the thing since, but have yet to stay at the school till dark again. What scares me is that I see it at home. I don't remember when exactly it started, but about a week after the first incident, I woke up to the same shaped figure under a streetlight outside my house. Then a week later, I had sleep paralysis, and it was in my corner. It's kind of hard for me to explain because I am so desensitized to it, and all the other memories are a bit foggy, but I was scared shitless. Now here's the weird parts. Not that any of this is normal. It became more frequent after the first bedroom appearance. It would be every week, to twice a week, to every few days, to every day. Now I see it all the time. If I wake up at night, in the hallway, in a dark closet, corners, but only if I'm alone. It's never hurt me or advanced on me yet, nor have I tried to communicate with it, and it doesn't move at all, but I know it watches me. It seems to be everywhere. I didn't see it yesterday, as it was Thanksgiving and I was with my family all day, and I slept like a baby last night. But I don't know what to do. Does anyone have any ideas of what this is? Or ideas on what to do next? I need advice, and I don't want to be the laughing stock of my town, so I haven't told anyone, not even my mom. Thank you, and please comment if you know anything. I'm starting to feel a bit insane. Every hotel I stay in, I secretly hope is haunted, and this one seemed promising. I was in New Mexico on a work trip, and my employees were putting me up for a 3-night stay in one of the biggest and best hotels in the city. I checked online and saw that the hotel used to be a hospital before it was condemned in the 80s, and reopened as a hotel in the 2000s. That was a great sign for its haunting potential. It's not necessarily that I want to see a ghost or whatever. I'm not even sure I believe in the paranormal, but I've always been open to experiencing a ghoul or two. Not only that, but haunted is usually shorthand for really cool building with lots of history. When I arrived on a comfortable, arid night, I could see that the hotel was certainly cool and wore its history proudly. The hulking copper and tan structure dominated the block it rested on. It looked like the building had willed itself into existence, out of a sand dune, and a whole city sprung up in the desert around it. I approached the stairs leading up to the front door, and discovered something that was disturbingly on brand for a place that was once a former hospital. There was a discarded IV needle laying carelessly on the sidewalk in front of the building. I highly doubted it was a relic from the ancient hospital days, and more likely a junkie who decided to escape from a local hospital, though I don't know where the nearest operational hospital was. I checked in at the front desk and was ushered up to my room on the 4th floor, delighting in the fanciness of having an old-fashioned bellboy escort. The room was smaller than I expected, but quite lovely. There was a bed, naturally, a little side table, some nice older art, and an ornate mirror on the wall opposite the bed. I wouldn't have guessed that this used to be a patient room in a hospital, but given the hotel's history, it must have been. It was certainly the right size, plus the "Do Not Disturb" tag on the doorknob said, "Quarantine, do not disturb." It was fun, the little ways in which the hotel embraced its weird, possibly spooky history. Despite how bad I wanted to explore the little city block around me, I'd arrived quite late, and knew I should probably just get to sleep. I had 2 big work days in front of me. I cranked up the AC until the room was my comfortable level of freezing, climbed into the enormous bed, and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling very weird. At first, it took me a while to figure out I was even awake. I blinked my eyes rapidly, but couldn't seem to get the thin film of gooey sleep off of them. Finally, I could see just enough to make out the clock. It was 3:03 local time. I was disoriented cognitively, but positively miserable physically. My whole body ached, I was freezing, and I could feel that my lymph nodes had swollen. Everybody has the telltale symptom that they are capital S sick. Mine have always been my lymph nodes. If they're swollen enough that I can feel them, then I know I'm fucked. Some virus has compromised my immune system and I need to take action. I didn't have a thermometer on hand, but just knew I had a fever too. Damn it, this was bad. This was a legitimate sickness, and I had no idea how I was going to get through my work obligations tomorrow. Though the idea of moving at all seemed like the worst thing in the world to me, I rolled out of bed and pried open my suitcase where I had a handful of aspirin contained in a Ziploc bag. I popped 3 in my mouth, adjusted the temperature in the room to be warmer, and got back in bed. It seemed impossible that I would ever get back to sleep. I felt so miserable. Somehow, however, I was asleep again within an hour or so. When I woke up the next day, I was delighted to discover that I felt perfectly normal. Not just normal, but great. Nothing feels as good as normal does after a sudden sickness. I assume that the aspirin must have really kicked some ass. I know they're only supposed to address pain, but it felt like they had thoroughly defeated whatever was inside me. Following a hotel breakfast of mostly pastries, I took a shuttle out to complete all my work meetings and activities for the day. I felt fine for the duration of meetings and conferences. When the evening rolled around, I even got to explore the city like I had wanted to. After partaking in some nightfall, I arrived back to the hotel around midnight and got into bed. I screwed around on my phone for about half an hour, and then began the process of getting to sleep. I woke up to myself dying, or at least it felt like I was dying. Once again, I could barely see, and even after multiple blinks, my eyesight was blurry. I was frozen solid, and also on fire. Sweat occurred on my forehead to the point where it began to drip into my eyes, which only improved my vision. My lymph nodes were golf balls shoved haphazardly into the top of my throat. If my temperature last night was 100 degrees, this must have been 102 or 103 at least. I had no idea what to do. Aspirin was apparently a miracle drug, but how on earth would I muster the strength to get off the bed and retrieve it? With great concentration and concerted strength, I fell from my side onto my back to be in a better moving position. When I was on my back, however, I noticed something in the mirror at the foot of my bed. There was a person in the room with me. A red-haired woman wearing whites, standing next to my bed. I could barely make her out through the haze of the fever and my blurred vision, but I was sure she was there. She seemed faint and intangible. I couldn't move any farther. I was paralyzed. Whether through my shock and fear or sheer sickness, I don't know. I couldn't move my head to the right or the left to even see if there was indeed another human being in the room. I could only observe everything through the mirror at the foot of my bed. In the mirror, I watched as the white-clad figure drew closer to me, bent down and maneuvered a small object towards my right arm. It wasn't until I felt the sting that I realized it was a needle. Warmth coursed from my arm through the rest of my body and I passed out. I woke up gasping the next morning. I was shivering, but not because it was cold. I could tell right away that I was no longer sick yet again. Did I just experience a fever dream? But why did I have a fever in the first place? And was I really dreaming? Something was clearly horribly wrong here. I was due back on the shuttle and off to another round of working meetings in a couple of hours. Working today felt insurmountable, but I still had to do it. There was just something else I needed to do first. After another round of breakfast pastries, I approached the front desk of the hotel and politely asked for another room. I told them that I knew this was a hassle, but I really felt like I must be allergic to something in my current room or something. I explained my feverish episodes the 2 nights prior, but naturally downplayed some of the details so I couldn't come across as a lunatic. They said they'd see what they could do. The day's round of meetings and presentation was miserable. All I could think about was whether the hotel would be able to find me another room. If they couldn't, would I have to find another hotel? That seemed like such an expensive hassle over something that had to have some kind of logical explanation. When my workday was over, I booked it back to the hotel and straight to the front desk. Good news. They had found me another room, on the first floor near the back of the building. It seemed as though this room was much more exclusive and pricey, so they must have been startled by my talk of allergens and sickness. The new room was lovely. There was a mahogany bookcase by the wall, and to my delight, no mirror at the foot of the bed, or anywhere else for that matter. Perhaps this was some sort of office, or maybe even doctor's quarters in the old hospital. Whatever its original purpose, the room felt like a refuge now, so I declined any opportunities to hit the town once more, and spent the evening getting some work done and replying to emails. As midnight rolled around, I was hesitant to even go back to sleep at all. This was the last night of my stay, and just pulling an all-nighter sounded appealing. Exhaustion overcame me though, and I realized I would need to get at least a few hours of sleep. Around 1 a.m., I created a little oasis of water, aspirin, and my phone on the nightstand next to me, just in case I needed any of them during an overnight emergency. I settled into the cold bed and quickly fell asleep. When I woke up an hour later, my whole body burned. It felt as though my heart was pumping thick molten lava throughout my body instead of life. This time I could open my eyes fully and take in my surroundings. I knew I had a fever again, but it was the least of my concern. I had reached a level of sickness previously unknown to me. My mouth was so dry, which seemed impossible because I was covered in sweat. Each breath was agony, but I took a deep, gasping breaths anyway, because I was afraid any one would be my last. I was terrified. With all my strength, I sat up in bed and reached out to grab my phone to call 911. As I grabbed the phone, an impossibly pale, impossibly white hand placed itself on top of mine, and with little effort forced my hand and the phone back down. I mustered the last of my strength to look up and see who the hand belonged to. A woman's face looked down upon me. Her face appeared to be covered in a thick, pale layer of makeup base. It made it seem as though her features glowed in the dark, or maybe they just did. Her hair was bright red, and she had dark circles around her eyes. She smiled, removed her hand from mine, and then gently covered my nose and mouth. She smelled like nothing. I gasped for air, didn't get enough, and passed out. The next thing I remember is a burst of light and sound. Machines beeping, people yelling. I could breathe now, but barely. This was a dream. Another dream. They've all just been dreams. Please tell me they've just been dreams. Wake up, I muttered, aloud groggily. The action slowed and my eyes started to make sense of the shapes around me. There were 3 men in the room with me. 2 wearing white coats, 1 wearing scrubs. Doctors. "Buddy, you're awake. God knows how," one of the doctors said. I took in some more of my surroundings as best I could. I was unmistakably in a hospital. I was laying in a gurney, and there were lime green vinyl dividers on my left and right. Next to me was a cart with some medical equipment on it. Perhaps a heart monitor, but there wasn't the little line heads-up display that you see on TV. On the cart was what seemed like dozens of spent gloves, and open packages of needles, stents, or whatever else they do to you in a hospital. I looked down to see a limp blanket covered my body, and a tube protruding past a bandage on my left side. A doctor with a heavy, carefully maintained beard approached me, sat on a little chair next to my bed, and placed his hand on either side of my neck, feeling my lymph nodes. "Did you bring anyone with you to the hospital today, mister?" he asked. I didn't. I don't know how I got here. Am I sick? Am I better now?" I stammered. The doctor closed his eyes, took in a deep breath, and nodded. "Is there anyone who would want to hurt you?" he asked. "No," I said. "I don't think so." Do you or anyone you know have access to thallium chloride? No. Do you know what thallium chloride is? No. The doctor stood up and crossed his arms, his eyes darting back and forth as though examining me, searching for a lie. Excuse me one moment, he said. With a jerk of his head, the doctor motioned his two colleagues out of my little cubicle and closed the curtain behind them. Beyond the curtain, I heard the men talking in hushed voices. I could only make out the phrase, "It's her. I'm telling you, it's her." After a couple of minutes, the lead, bearded doctor emerged back through the sheets. "I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" "Yeah," I said. "You were very sick. Very sick. In fact, if you were here one more night without our care, I think you might not have made it. But you're stable now. You're going to be okay. Do you understand?" Yeah. "Good. Now I need you to leave." "What?" I gasped. The doctor closed his eyes and held up his hand to quiet me. "No matter what you do, you're not going to be safe here. You're okay now, but to stay okay you have to leave. Do you have someone who can pick you up?" "No, I'm not from here," I said. "Can you get a taxi?" "I can get an Uber." "A what?" "A lift?" "Yeah, get a lift," the doctor said. "I'm going to leave you here now. I need you to count to 100, and after you do that, I need you to walk out the front door and leave. Can you do that?" "Yeah," I said. I was so disoriented and scared that I was willing to comply with such a strange request. Plus, the man wasn't lying. I really did feel okay. Without another word, the doctor retreated back behind the curtain, and I counted to 100. As I crawled out of my gurney, I noticed for the first time that I was fully dressed in my usual clothes. Jeans, button-up, even socks and shoes. Seems weird that they dressed me before a hospital stay. I exited my space, expecting to see the signs of a bustling hospital all around me, but I appeared to be the only one on this ward now. The lights were even turned off. I walked out of the room and down the hall in a daze. I was moving fast towards an exit that I somehow knew exactly where to find. I encountered nobody else on my way. I found the set of double doors leading to the outside world, and I pushed through them to enter into the blistering New Mexico morning. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to order the lift. As I did, I was aware again of the tube protruding from the adhesive on the back of my hand. It was now connected to nothing. Had it always been? Ignoring that for a moment in a disorientation, I opened the app to get my ride. As I prepared to type in the address of the hotel, I saw on the map that a little blue dot was hovering right above the hotel I had spent 2.5 tortured nights in. When I turned around towards the doors of the hospital, I discovered that they were the doors of the hotel. Looking inside the small window pane on one of the doors, I could see the hotel lobby. A bellboy carried some bags toward the elevator. I gingerly pulled the needle out of my hand, and because I couldn't think of anything else to do, dropped it on the sidewalk in front of me.